2 huitièmes 1 plus 1 à 600 mètres.
Hello from editing. I am really excited about this week's video because it's an honest look at what Jess, Diana, and myself have struggled with in terms of our own journeys with nutrition, as well as some tips for you to consider along the way with your journey. Now, that being said, this is by no means a guide. It is really just for your consideration to think about different tips and tricks that have worked or not worked for us. We get a little bit more honest in this one. We'd love to know if you like that better. Enjoy.
My history with food. Part 1 of 7,900. My history with food is pretty simple, actually. It's always been bad. Growing up, there was a lot of concern around aesthetic and appearance, and I never quite fit in properly to that. And I'm not throwing anybody under the bus with that. It was just born of concern. I always kind of trended in the wrong direction as a little kid. As soon as I hit 10 or 11, I started to fill out. As I kind of started growing up, I started growing out twice as fast. And it sparked concern for my parents. I was sent to personal trainers when I was 10, sent to different systems, diets. I was the kid that was sent to school with broccoli and, wanted to trade for the fruit roll-ups and whatnot. It's like that scene from Uncle Buck with Macaulay Culkin. It created an unhealthy relationship between me and food, where I kind of got to a point where I would try to resist it, and then I would fall off that wagon and binge or eat things I thought I wasn't supposed to be eating, and then punish myself for it. Feel bad, degrade myself through like internal dialogue, what have you. And I would get some of that from external sources as well. And that was part of a larger issue. Of course, it's never just one thing. It's always based in a very complex web of issues and cycles and various kind of tropes that we tend to live by. But I, would have momentary glimpses of a better way. I would do something that helped me and actually helped me, and I would then fall out of it eventually. But I'd kind of keep that at the back of the mind. And you get to a point where you kind of had cobbled together something that sort of worked. But then it was committing to it, because the other forces, like I said, the complex web, right? The other forces would come back and start driving you back towards the old habits. But you'd remember these other things and you could go back to them when you could. So for me, the food aspect is not so much about the food itself. It's about how it fits into the broader range of what makes me me. And when I start improving that relationship all along that web, it improves my relationship with food. And when I start improving my relationship with food, I start improving my relationship with every other aspect of my health. And it all works together to make me feel better in general. And sometimes that falls off and you go to your support system. I always think about how Dee talks about her support system and whatnot, and it really makes me think through, like, okay, so who can I go to for help? I always get to that point where I have to be able to say to myself, like, I'm okay today. I'm okay today. I feel okay today. And I can get through today and feel good about the decisions that I'm making. Tomorrow's a different day. I'll take on tomorrow. I'm not going to worry about it quite yet. So what's worked for me, obviously, is a kind of all forms approach. It's nothing about diet particularly. I am doing intermittent fasting because for me, that gives me a little bit of structure, which I like, and I know I work well with. Further to doing all of the work that I need to do to better myself in other aspects of my life is going to help me with maintaining positive mental image and thus making it easier to make better food choices if I'm not getting down on myself and needing to go eat a full bag of buttercream icing that I've stolen from Dee.
I've used food as a coping mechanism, I've used food as a crutch, and I've used food as a form of self-punishment. I've used food in every way that I possibly could except for sustenance for a very long time in my life. It took a lot in order to change that, but now that I'm in a healthy place, it's absolutely worth it. What have I tried in terms of nutrition? I'm now going to list off a bunch of things that you should probably never try as forms of ways that I tried to maintain my body weight balance. I tried a gum diet, which all I did was chew gum all day. I tried cayenne pepper and lemon water and didn't eat for 3 days, then bailed completely and would binge on whatever I could find. I've tried not caring and just exercising and eating whatever I want. Then eventually I switched to trying to control portions and just having more meals. Then I switched to having bigger meals but larger portions, but only 2 meals a day. I've tried fasting. I've tried all sorts of things that you can imagine. I've tried taking out macronutrients, adding in macronutrients. I've tried a lot. It took me a long time to figure out what worked best for me and what I could actually sustain as a lifestyle. My relationship with food changed shortly after a pretty big life event when I started taking care of myself a little bit better, and I realized that I really didn't want to go back to an old way of life where everything was very inconsistent and unmanageable. When I learned how to start controlling my portions and when the best time to eat was for me, that's when I really started to have a change of relationship with food. Then I started seeing food mostly as sustenance. As soon as I started seeing food as sustenance versus a coping mechanism or something that actually gave me joy and was one of the only things that was giving me joy, then it started to be a much better and healthier relationship.
My history with food didn't used to be complicated. I wasn't a person who dieted really in my life. I grew up fairly lean. I grew up dancing. I was very active. At a certain point, I did notice that I had gained a little bit of weight and was a little bit self-conscious, kind of uncomfortable. So I would sometimes go through a couple weeks here and there where I would just not eat a whole bunch of treats that I like to eat, and I would cut back on sugars and things like that. But nothing, I was never super focused on losing weight or changing my weight with food for a long time. When I decided to compete in a bikini bodybuilding competition, I had to learn a new way of eating. I was used to eating very freely, just enjoying my food, eating with friends, kind of whatever, eating whatever felt right. And then I had to flip the switch and go into a very restricted way of eating. So I ended up tracking my macronutrients, so my proteins, fats, and carb, according to what my contest prep nutrition coach was coaching me to do. So this was to get very rapid fat loss while maintaining as much muscle as I could keep. This required me to weigh, measure, track every single thing I ate and drank. That was really weird for me. It was a huge adjustment from never really thinking too much about food. So going into that, my world all of a sudden shifted to being completely revolved around food. Because I was aiming for a specific goal that was not healthy, and I knew that going into this was a performance-based competitive goal that I was excited to try to compete in. So doing that and having to go to very strict weight loss where I was cutting the amount of food I was eating quite frequently to be able to maintain a certain fat loss, I ended up having to completely disconnect from my body and the signals that my body would give me that I was hungry. So in order to kind of stay at a very low caloric intake, I was feeling very tired. I had low energy. My fuse was quite short, and the people close to me will attest to that as well. And I got really anxious and obsessed with food. When your whole day revolves around like the fact that you're hungry and kind of feel crappy, you have no thought in your head really except for the next meal and what that's going to be and how you're going to weigh it and measure it and fit it in to your macros. And if you're going to have a little bit of room for something that feels indulgent and sweet and tasty, because I have quite a sweet tooth. So that was pretty tough to always be focused on food, but for that time in my life, it was something that I had planned for and was okay with doing. I did make sure to share a lot of my feelings with my support network, so my family and friends, because it was really hard to go through every day feeling stressed out. And, you know, I remember going to a coffee shop and ordering a latte, and I'd put in my macros and had it all fit in, but then they didn't have skim milk. So then it threw me off, and I just panicked and was like, I don't know what to order now. And it was like just over a coffee. That for me was a moment to be like, wow, this is really abnormal behavior, and I need to make a note not to continue this after I'm done competing. So having really good people around me to kind of bounce those feelings off of was really helpful, and helped me not get like even more entrenched in those feelings of stress and anxiety around food. A big thing that came up after competing was me having to kind of go back to a normal caloric intake after being so restricted for so long. After my first show, I knew right away that I was going to compete again exactly a year later. So I started doing a reverse diet where I was slowly increasing my calories with the help of my coaches. But because I knew that, I was always in this sort of anxious state where I was like, well, I just have to eat whatever I can before I start prepping again. So after going through this reverse diet period where I wasn't really paying attention to my hunger levels and was just following my food intake kind of blindly, I went back into a full prep again and was back to being anxious and all that kind of stuff. So partway through that last prep, I kind of decided that I was excited after my show to start taking care of my body after making it get really lean and kind of mess with my hormones and my mental health a little bit. So I made this switch. Once I finished competing the second time, I did a little bit of reverse dieting with my coaches, but then right away I kind of felt that I wanted to start listening to what my body was telling me and stop ignoring it like I had been for those 2 years of competing. It's taken me a lot of time to really think about what my body's trying to tell me, but basically, if I'm hungry, I eat, and I do make a point to prioritize foods that are going to help me feel good and help me feel full. So I like to balance my protein, my fats, and my carbs, and I'd like to get my vegetables and fruits in there because I enjoy those. But then I also make a point to think about, like, why am I choosing to eat this while I'm eating this? Right? Like, I want to think about if I'm going to like run home and go right to the fridge and grab the first thing I see, or am I going to sit down and be like, hey, I feel like eating chocolate chips right now because I'm just really hungry and feel like snacking on something. Okay, well, maybe that's not actually what my body needs. So then I'll put together a more thoughtful snack where I'm balancing it out with all those macronutrients, or making sure I'm getting vegetables if I haven't had any yet that day, or increasing my protein if I haven't had much that day. Another thing that I'm doing is checking in with how I feel while I'm eating. I was always the person who really enjoyed sweets, and so I would kind of just like, if there were donuts, I would just eat the donuts because they tasted good. But now, after kind of learning to listen to my body, I can see a giant plate of delicious looking donuts or a cake with buttercream icing, and I can eat it and kind of be aware that, wow, this is really good and I'm really enjoying this, but if I get full, I can stop. And that was one thing that I wasn't doing even before having competed. So being able to go through that, like ignoring my body, learning to listen to my body, has actually helped me develop a healthier relationship with food and has taught me how to listen to what my body is telling me.
My top 3 guidelines would be, number 1 is portion size. I love having variety, therefore I'd rather have a smaller portion and have multiple varieties of food over a period of time than a large lump sum of one type of food. I find that having more variety makes me feel fuller because it feeds my eyes as much as my stomach. Second would be make better choices. When I look at a meal or I'm planning a meal out for myself, I try to look at that meal and say, how can I make this a little bit healthier today? I don't have to change the entire meal, but let's say I want pizza. I'm gonna have pizza, but how can I make pizza as healthy as possible for me in this moment? Number 3 is I ask myself, am I full? So often when I eat, and I don't know about other people, but I find that as soon as I've eaten, within minutes of finishing that food, I feel hungry again. And this is a common thing that I found happen throughout my life. And really, it's my body digesting, or it's my mind still feeling the hunger from previous moments. So I try to wait 10 to 15 minutes after I've eaten a meal in order to really check if I'm actually still hungry before I choose to eat again.
My top 3 tips are probably to make sure that you're getting exercise done regularly, which we can help you with. Sorry.
You can do it.
My top 3 tips are probably all going to be take care of yourself, check in on yourself, and love yourself, because whatever you're doing for your diet has to start from a place of love. It can't start from a place of punishment. It's the wrong reason, according to me, to start to diet, because if you're not good enough to start, you'll never be good enough. And you are good enough.